Snow blanketed the small town of Evergreen Hollow, muffling the world under its heavy, quiet weight. From his window, Nicholas Harper could see the festive lights strung along Main Street, twinkling against the backdrop of falling snowflakes. He turned away, retreating into the solitude of his small, sparsely furnished home. His own decorations had been packed away a decade ago, the year his world fell apart. He traced his fingers along the worn edge of the wooden mantel, where a single framed photograph rested. The picture captured a perfect moment: his wife, Sarah, and their son, Jamie, laughing as they posed in front of a Christmas tree. He hadn't touched the frame in years. Memories of that last Christmas Eve played like a film on repeat in his mind, each detail etched into his soul. He was late picking up Sarah and Jamie from the church pageant. The roads had been icy. By the time he reached the scene, it was too late. Now, 10 years later, Nicholas existed, but barely. Each holiday season brought with it the suffocating weight of guilt and sorrow, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. But guilt had also driven him to the shelter downtown, where he spent hours repairing broken toys and serving warm meals to those in need. It was work that didn't require conversation, only his hands. That was how he preferred it. He was wiping his tools clean when a soft, high-pitched voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, mister?" Nicholas looked up to see a little girl with curly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. Her coat was too thin for the biting cold, and her small hands clutched a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. She couldn't have been older than 8. "Can you fix him?" she asked, holding out the rabbit. "His name's Mr. Thumper." Nicholas hesitated. Something in her hopeful eyes tugged at him, a faint echo of Jamie's voice years ago, asking if they could stay up late to wait for Santa. He reached for the toy and examined the loose stitching. "I can fix him," he said quietly. Her face lit up. "Thank you. Mr. Thumper's been my best friend since I was little." Nicholas almost smiled at her enthusiasm. "What's your name?" "Emma," she said. "And you're Mr. Harper, right? The lady in the kitchen said you're good at fixing things." He nodded. "I try." Emma lingered, watching as he threaded a needle and began repairing the rabbit's ear. She fidgeted for a moment before blurting out, "Do you think Christmas is a time for miracles?" Nicholas froze, the needle hovering over the fabric. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe it is for some people. For me, it has to be," she said firmly. "I need a Christmas miracle." He looked at her, curious despite himself. "Why's that?" Emma's gaze dropped to her worn shoes. "I want to find my mom. And my brother." Nicholas set the rabbit down, his chest tightening. "What happened to them?" "My mom disappeared a long time ago," Emma explained, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "She went out to get groceries one day and never came back. My brother, he's older. He went to the army, but now he's gone too. I think they're still out there. Somewhere." Nicholas didn't know what to say. He had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, but Emma's plea struck a chord deep within him. The loss in her voice mirrored his own, and he saw himself in her small, brave frame, fighting against a world that felt too big and cold. "You're not alone," he said finally. "You've got people here who care." "But they're not my family," Emma said, lifting her chin stubbornly. "I think you're supposed to help me. My grandma used to say that people cross your path for a reason." "Your grandma sounds wise." She was. Before she passed, she told me to never give up on finding my family. Emma paused, her eyes shining. "You'll help me, won't you? Please." Nicholas opened his mouth to protest, to tell her he wasn't the kind of man she needed for this. But as he looked into her determined eyes, he felt something stir, a faint whisper of purpose, of redemption. "Let me think about it," he said, his voice soft. Emma nodded, her smile returning as she picked up Mr. Thumper, now fully repaired. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. You're already a miracle worker." As she skipped off, Nicholas stood alone in the quiet shelter, the sound of her words lingering like a song. He didn't believe in miracles, not anymore. But for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could be part of someone else's. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the bitter chill remained. Nicholas found himself walking toward the shelter earlier than usual, bundled in his heavy coat and scarf. Sleep had evaded him the night before. Thoughts of Emma, her determined voice, and her plea had kept him awake. He didn't know why he cared. He didn't know why her words had stuck with him when so many others over the years hadn't. The shelter was bustling when he arrived. Volunteers setting up tables for breakfast and sorting through donated clothes. Nicholas slipped into the small workshop in the back, where shelves were lined with battered toys awaiting repair. The smell of sawdust and glue greeted him like an old friend. He settled into his chair and began work on a wooden train with a cracked wheel, hoping the familiar rhythm would quiet his mind. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm and a folded piece of paper in the other. She looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. "You're here early," Nicholas said, his tone more neutral than warm. Emma took a step closer, holding out the paper. "I brought you something." Nicholas took it, unfolding the worn page carefully. It was a letter, written in looping handwriting that struck him as oddly familiar. He scanned the words, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "It was in a backpack someone donated to the shelter. I found it last week. The lady said I could keep it." The letter was short, but it spoke volumes. It was addressed to no one in particular, a message of regret and longing, written by someone who had clearly lost something, or someone. The words seemed to echo in Nicholas's chest, stirring up memories he thought he had buried. "I thought it might help," Emma said softly. "It talks about family. Maybe it's a sign." Nicholas folded the letter and handed it back to her. "Emma, letters like this don't mean anything. They're just words." She frowned, clutching the paper to her chest. "But what if it does mean something? What if it's a clue?" "A clue to what?" "To finding my mom. Or my brother." Nicholas sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to crush her hope, but he also didn't want to encourage it. "Emma, I can't promise you anything. People don't always get the endings they're hoping for." Her expression hardened, her young face suddenly fierce. "But they don't get them if they don't try." Nicholas stared at her, speechless. She was right, of course, though he didn't want to admit it. Trying hadn't saved Sarah and Jamie. Trying hadn't undone his mistakes. But Emma wasn't him, and her determination was unshakable. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "I'll help you. But only for a little while." Emma's face lit up, her grin wide and bright. "Really? You mean it?" He nodded, already regretting his decision. "I mean it. But don't get your hopes up too much, okay? This might not lead anywhere." "It'll lead somewhere," she said confidently. "You'll see." She skipped out of the workshop, leaving Nicholas alone with his thoughts. He picked up the letter again, reading it more carefully this time. The handwriting wasn't just familiar. It was hauntingly so. He shook his head, setting it aside. It didn't matter. It couldn't matter. That afternoon, Emma and Nicholas started their search. Their first stop was the address written on the letter's envelope, a small house on the edge of town. It was run down, the shutters hanging crookedly and the yard overgrown. Nicholas knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. An older woman peered out, her eyes wary. "Can I help you?" Nicholas hesitated, unsure of what to say. Emma, however, stepped forward, clutching the letter. "We're looking for someone," she said. "Do you know who wrote this?" The woman squinted at the paper, then shook her head. "Sorry, can't say I do. That's not my handwriting." "Do you know who used to live here?" Nicholas asked. The woman sighed. "I've been here for 6 years. Whoever was here before me left in a hurry. Don't know where they went." Emma's shoulders slumped, but she thanked the woman politely before turning back to Nicholas. He could see the disappointment in her eyes, but she didn't complain. "We'll try the next place," she said, her voice steady. Nicholas felt a pang of admiration for her resilience. She reminded him of Jamie, who had always bounced back quickly from setbacks, always looking ahead instead of dwelling on what went wrong. Their search continued over the next few days, each lead bringing more questions than answers. They visited shelters, talked to neighbors, and followed every scrap of information they could find. The letter seemed to be a dead end. But Emma refused to give up. Nicholas found himself drawn deeper into her quest, despite his initial reluctance. He started to see her as more than just a child in need. She was a spark of light in a world he had long since decided was dark and cold. Her hope was contagious, even if he didn't want to admit it. One evening, as they walked back to the shelter, Emma slipped her hand into his. He glanced down at her, surprised by the gesture. "Thanks for helping me," she said quietly. "Even if we don't find them, it means a lot." Nicholas felt his throat tighten. He hadn't done much, certainly not enough to deserve her gratitude. But her words warmed something inside him, something that had been frozen for years. "You're welcome," he said gruffly. As they reached the shelter, Emma turned to him with a smile. "I think tomorrow's the day we find a real clue." Nicholas didn't share her optimism, but he nodded anyway. "We'll see." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Emma's words. He wanted to believe she was right. He wanted to believe in miracles again. But part of him still feared what they might find if they kept digging, and what it might mean for both of them. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. Nicholas stood in the shelter's kitchen, pouring himself a cup of bitter coffee while the hum of activity buzzed around him. Volunteers moved in and out, balancing trays of warm food and stacks of donated clothing. Emma was late. He hadn't expected to worry, but as the minutes ticked by, he found himself glancing at the door every few seconds. When she finally appeared, bundled in her too-thin coat and clutching her rabbit as usual, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and she wore the same determined expression he'd come to recognize. "You're late," he said, masking his relief with a gruff tone. "Sorry," Emma said, setting Mr. Thumper carefully on a chair before pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I found this." Nicholas frowned, taking the paper from her outstretched hand. It wasn't another letter, but a photocopy of an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Local woman disappears without a trace." His eyes scanned the text, catching the name Emma had mentioned before. Her mother, Allison. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "One of the volunteers said they remembered my mom," Emma said, her eyes lighting up. "She gave me that and told me to ask Mr. Lyle at the library. She said he knows everything." Nicholas folded the article and slipped it into his coat pocket. "All right, we'll go see Mr. Lyle. But don't get your hopes up, okay? People forget things or they get details wrong." Emma just smiled, her unwavering optimism shining through. "You'll see. It's a good clue. I can feel it." They arrived at the library a short while later, the old building creaking in the wind. Inside, it smelled of dust and paper, the kind of smell that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Mr. Lyle was easy to find. An older man with a white beard and thick glasses perched behind the circulation desk. "Can I help you?" he asked, peering at them over his glasses. Emma stepped forward before Nicholas could respond. "We're looking for my mom," she said, holding up the article. "Someone said you might know more about this." Mr. Lyle took the paper and read it slowly, his brow furrowing. "Ah, yes. I remember this," he said after a moment. "Allison was a sweet girl. She used to come here often, always with a book in hand. Then one day, she was just gone. No one knew what happened. Such a shame. Do you know where she might have gone?" Nicholas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Lyle shook his head. "No, but," he paused, his eyes narrowing. "She mentioned something once, about wanting to leave town and start fresh. I think she was scared of someone, though she never said who. She left behind some of her things, you know? We packed them up in a box, just in case she came back. But she never did." Nicholas felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Do you still have the box?" Mr. Lyle nodded. "I believe we do. Wait here." As the librarian disappeared into the back, Emma turned to Nicholas, her eyes wide. "Do you think there's something important in the box?" "We'll find out soon enough," he said, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to. The weight of the mystery was growing heavier, the threads connecting it to his own life becoming harder to ignore. When Mr. Lyle returned, he held a dusty cardboard box, the edges fraying with age. He set it on the desk and pushed it toward Emma. "Here you go. I hope it helps." Emma opened the box eagerly, sifting through its contents. A few dog-eared books, a scarf, a half-empty notebook, and a stack of photographs. She pulled out one of the photos and froze. "That's her," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Nicholas leaned over to look. The photo showed a young woman with soft features and kind eyes, holding a baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. His stomach clenched. The woman looked familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd seen her before. Emma handed him another photo. This one made his breath catch. It was a group shot, taken in front of what looked like a Christmas tree lot. In the background, barely visible, was a face Nicholas recognized immediately: Sarah, his wife. His hands trembled as he stared at the picture. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice tight. Emma looked confused. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. His mind was racing, pieces of a puzzle snapping into place with each passing second. Sarah had volunteered at a community center in the years before she died. Could she have known Allison? And if she had, why had she never mentioned it? Mr. Harper? Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. "Do you know something?" Nicholas swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out." The librarian coughed gently, drawing their attention. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into the box. He pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. This was tucked into one of her books. "It looks like it was meant for someone specific." Nicholas took the envelope, his heart pounding. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Sarah's. He opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The words were few but devastating. "Nicholas, if you're reading this, I hope you understand. I tried to do the right thing." His knees felt weak as he leaned against the desk, the letter slipping from his fingers. Emma picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read it. "What does it mean?" she asked. Nicholas shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." As they left the library, the box of Allison's belongings in tow, Nicholas felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crack. The mystery was no longer just Emma's. It was his too, and the answers they were seeking might be far more complicated and far more personal than he'd ever imagined. The drive back to the shelter was quiet, the tension between Nicholas and Emma palpable. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her small hands clutching the envelope that had been tucked away in her mother's belongings. She stared out the frosted window, her breath forming small clouds on the glass. Nicholas, on the other hand, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts swirling in chaos. Sarah's handwriting on that letter had been like a ghost rising from the past. The few words she had written opened a door Nicholas wasn't sure he was ready to step through. What had she meant by doing the right thing? What connection did she have to Allison, to Emma's mother? He had lived for years avoiding the what-ifs of that night, but now they loomed larger than ever. Back at the shelter, they carried the box inside and found a quiet corner to go through its contents more thoroughly. Nicholas was methodical, carefully examining each item as if it might hold some hidden clue. Emma was less patient, flipping through the notebook and shuffling the photographs with quick, eager movements. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice a mixture of frustration and hope. "If your wife knew my mom, why didn't she tell you? Why didn't anyone say anything?" Nicholas didn't have an answer. He wanted to say that Sarah wouldn't have kept secrets from him, but the truth was, he didn't know. There had been a distance between them in the months leading up to the accident, a tension he hadn't understood at the time. Now, it seemed, there had been more beneath the surface than he ever realized. Emma pulled another photo from the stack, her fingers trembling. This one was a candid shot of Allison, standing in a kitchen Nicholas didn't recognize. Her expression was serious, almost somber. Taped to the corner of the photo was a scrap of paper with an address scrawled on it. Emma pointed to it excitedly. "Do you think this is where she went? Maybe this is where she was trying to go before she disappeared." Nicholas took the photo and examined the address. It wasn't far, just a few towns over. He nodded. "It's worth checking out." Emma's face lit up, her hope renewed. "When can we go?" "Tomorrow," Nicholas said. "It'll take a while to get there, and it's getting dark already." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Okay,
tomorrow.
That night, as Nicholas lay in bed, sleep eluded him once again. His thoughts returned to the letter in Sarah's handwriting, the words etched into his mind. He had always believed he knew everything there was to know about his wife, but now he wasn't so sure. Why hadn't she told him about Allison? What was she trying to protect him from, or protect herself from? The next morning, they set out early, the box of belongings left behind in the shelter for safekeeping. The drive was long, the scenery changing from snowy small-town streets to open, empty stretches of road lined with bare trees. Emma chattered nervously in the passenger seat, her excitement tempered by the uncertainty of what they might find. The address led them to a small, run-down house at the end of a gravel road. The paint was peeling, and the windows were covered with thick curtains, giving it a closed-off, unwelcoming appearance. Nicholas parked the car and turned to Emma. "Stay close to me," he said. "We don't know who's here." Emma nodded, clutching Mr. Thumper tightly to her chest as they approached the door. Nicholas knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the winter morning. For a moment, there was no response, and he was about to knock again when the door creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared, older and lined with deep wrinkles. His eyes were wary, flicking from Nicholas to Emma and back again. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "We're looking for someone," Nicholas said, holding up the photo of Allison. "Do you recognize her?" The man stared at the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "I knew her. She came here a few times, years ago. But I haven't seen her in a long time." Emma's face fell, but she stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Do you know where she went?" "She's my mom. I need to find her." The man's expression softened slightly. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. "You'd better come in. It's cold out there." The inside of the house was dimly lit and cluttered, with papers and boxes stacked on nearly every surface. The man motioned for them to sit at a small, wobbly table. Nicholas noticed a framed photograph on a nearby shelf, a younger version of the man with Allison, both smiling. He pointed to it. "You were close," Nicholas said. The man nodded. "She was my niece, but she didn't stay here long. She was always running from something, or someone. Never said much about it, but you could see it in her eyes. She was scared." "Did she ever say where she was going?" Nicholas asked. The man hesitated, then stood and rummaged through a pile of papers on a nearby counter. He returned with a yellowed envelope and handed it to Emma. "She left this behind. Said it was for her kids. I guess she hoped one day you'd find it." Emma opened the envelope with shaking hands, pulling out a letter written in her mother's handwriting. Tears filled her eyes as she read it silently, her lips moving slightly as she mouthed the words. Nicholas waited, his heart heavy as he watched her. When she finally looked up, her voice was small but steady. "She said she loved us. She said she wanted to come back, but she couldn't. She said she was trying to protect us." Nicholas placed a hand on her shoulder, unsure of what else to do. The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "She always meant well," he said quietly, "but she made a lot of mistakes. If she's still out there, I hope you find her." Emma nodded, clutching the letter tightly. For the first time since they'd started this journey, Nicholas saw tears spill down her cheeks. But even through her sadness, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, the same hope that had kept her going all along. Nicholas made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let Emma down. Whatever it took, they would find the answers they were looking for. The ride back to the shelter was quiet, the silence between Nicholas and Emma heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emma clutched the letter from her mother, as if it were the only thing tethering her to the hope she'd been holding onto for so long. Nicholas kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The questions swirling in his mind refused to settle. Who had Allison been running from? Why had Sarah never mentioned her? And most importantly, where was Allison now? The shelter was quiet when they arrived, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows through the frosted windows. Nicholas carried the box of belongings inside while Emma followed close behind, still clutching the letter. He set the box down on one of the long tables and turned to her. "Why don't you go get some dinner?" he suggested, trying to give her a moment to process everything. "I'll be here." Emma hesitated, then nodded. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket and walked toward the dining area, her small figure seeming even smaller under the weight of her emotions. Nicholas watched her go, his heart heavy. For all her resilience, she was still just a child, bearing burdens far too heavy for someone her age. He sat down at the table and began sifting through the box again, searching for anything they might have missed. Most of the items were unremarkable. Worn books, loose papers, a scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. But as he reached the bottom of the box, his fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled it out and found himself holding a key. The key was small and unmarked, its brass surface tarnished with age. Nicholas turned it over in his hand, frowning. It didn't seem to belong to anything in the box, and there had been no mention of it in the letter. He set it aside, intending to ask Emma about it later. As the evening wore on, Nicholas found himself drawn back to the photos they had uncovered. He spread them out across the table, studying each one carefully. Most were of Allison, some with Emma as a baby, others with a man Nicholas assumed was Emma's father. But one photo stood out, a candid shot of Allison standing next to Sarah, both of them laughing. It was taken in front of the community center where Sarah had volunteered, and the sight of it sent a pang through Nicholas's chest. Why hadn't she told him? Sarah had always been open about her work at the center, often sharing stories about the people she met. But she had never mentioned Allison or her struggles. Had she been trying to protect Nicholas from something? Or had she simply not known how to tell him? Lost in thought, Nicholas didn't hear Emma return until she was standing beside him. She looked down at the photos spread across the table and pointed to the one of Sarah and Allison. "Do you think they were friends?" she asked, her voice quiet. Nicholas nodded slowly. "It looks like it. Do you think my mom told her what was happening? Why she was scared?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she did, Sarah would have tried to help. That's just the kind of person she was." Emma's gaze lingered on the photo, her expression thoughtful. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Nicholas thought, but he didn't say it aloud. Instead, he simply nodded. "Yeah, I do." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then Emma's eyes landed on the key sitting on the table. "What's that?" she asked, reaching for it. "I found it in the box," Nicholas said. "Do you recognize it?" Emma turned it over in her hands, frowning. "No, but maybe it's important." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, studying her. Despite everything she had been through, her determination hadn't wavered. If anything, it seemed stronger now, fueled by the small pieces of her mother's story they had managed to uncover. He didn't want to admit it, but her hope was starting to rub off on him. "We'll figure it out," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Whatever this key opens, we'll find it." Emma smiled faintly, her grip on the key tightening. "Thank you, Mr. Harper, for everything." Nicholas felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together." That night, as Nicholas lay in bed, the key sat on the nightstand beside him, its presence a constant reminder of the questions they still needed to answer. He stared at it for a long time, his mind racing with possibilities. What did it open? A safe? A storage unit? Another piece of the puzzle waiting to be discovered? The next morning, they decided to start with the most obvious places: the shelter itself and the community center where Sarah and Allison had spent time. Nicholas asked the shelter manager if they had any locked storage areas that might match the key, but they came up empty. The community center was next, a weathered brick building that still bore the faint outlines of Christmas decorations from years past. The director of the center, a kind woman named Mrs. Caldwell, greeted them warmly when they explained their search. She led them to a small office in the back, where a dusty file cabinet stood against the wall. "This belonged to Sarah," Mrs. Caldwell explained, brushing off the top of the cabinet. "She used it to store records and supplies. No one's touched it since she passed." Nicholas felt a pang of guilt as he stared at the cabinet. He hadn't known it was still here, another part of Sarah's life left behind after the accident. Emma held up the key, her eyes hopeful. "Can we try it?" she asked. Mrs. Caldwell nodded, stepping aside. Emma handed the key to Nicholas, and he hesitated for only a moment before sliding it into the lock. It turned with a faint click, and the cabinet door creaked open. Inside was a stack of folders and a small metal box. Nicholas reached for the box first, his hands trembling. He set it on the desk and opened it slowly, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and a notebook. As Emma leaned in to look, Nicholas realized the answers they had been searching for might finally be within reach. But with those answers would come more questions, and perhaps truths he wasn't ready to face. The notebook was the first thing Nicholas picked up from the metal box. Its leather cover was worn and creased, and the pages inside were filled with Sarah's familiar handwriting. Emma stood beside him, her eyes wide as she stared at the stack of letters and photos still inside the box. Nicholas took a deep breath and opened the notebook, his heart pounding. The entries weren't dated, but they painted a vivid picture of Sarah's life at the community center. She wrote about the people she met, their struggles, and the small victories that gave her hope. As Nicholas flipped through the pages, he began to see a side of Sarah he hadn't fully known, a woman deeply committed to helping others even when it weighed on her. Then he came to a page that stopped him cold. I met someone today who reminded me of how fragile life can be. Her name is Allison, and she's in trouble. She has a young daughter and another baby on the way, but she's terrified of the man she's running from. She wouldn't say much, only that she's desperate to keep her children safe. I told her I would help her, no matter what it takes. Nicholas stared at the words, his chest tightening. He read the passage again, as if doing so would somehow change the meaning. Allison had come to Sarah for help, and Sarah had promised to protect her. But why hadn't she told him? Why had she carried this burden alone? What does it say? Emma's voice was small, barely above a whisper. Nicholas hesitated, then handed her the notebook. It's about your mom, he said. Sarah was trying to help her. Emma's hands trembled as she took the notebook, her eyes scanning the page. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of confusion and hope. Do you think she kept her promise? I don't know, Nicholas admitted, but she would have done everything she could. Emma nodded, clutching the notebook to her chest. She was brave, wasn't she? She was, Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. Braver than I ever realized. They turned their attention to the rest of the box. The photographs were mostly candid shots from the community center. Smiling children, volunteers serving meals, and holiday events. But tucked among them was another photo of Allison, this time standing with a man Nicholas didn't recognize. His face was sharp and stern, his eyes cold even in the grainy black and white image. Who's that? Emma asked, pointing to the man. I don't know, Nicholas said, but if your mom was scared, maybe he's the reason why. Emma frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. Do you think he's still looking for her? Nicholas didn't want to answer, but he couldn't lie to her either. It's possible. But if your mom went through all this to keep you safe, she must have found a way to stay ahead of him. Emma nodded, though her expression remained troubled. She reached for the letters next, pulling them out one by one. Most were written by Sarah, addressed to Allison. They spoke of encouragement, support, and offers of help. But there was one letter that stood out, a reply from Allison, written in shaky handwriting. Sarah, thank you for everything you've done. I don't know how I would have made it this far without you, but I can't stay here. It's not safe. I need to keep moving, for the sake of my kids. Please don't try to find me. It's better this way. Allison. Nicholas felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the letter aloud. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Instead, she reached for another photo, a picture of Sarah and Nicholas together, smiling on what must have been a rare moment of peace. She really cared about my mom, Emma said, her voice trembling. She wanted to help her. She did, Nicholas said. She would have done anything to protect her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the discovery settling between them. Then Emma straightened, her expression resolute. We have to keep going. If Sarah was trying to help my mom, then maybe she left something else behind. Something that can tell us where she went. Nicholas nodded, his determination matching Emma's. We'll figure it out. They spent the rest of the day searching the community center, going through old records and talking to staff members who had been there during Sarah's time. Most didn't remember much, but one volunteer recalled Sarah mentioning a safe house where she sent families in crisis. It was run by a woman named Marjorie, who lived in a neighboring town. The name rang a faint bell in Nicholas's mind, though he couldn't place it. They thanked the volunteer and left the center, the name Marjorie now their next lead. Emma was unusually quiet on the ride back, staring out the window with Mr. Thumper clutched tightly in her lap. Nicholas didn't press her, knowing she needed time to process everything they had learned. That evening, as they sat together in the shelter's workshop, Nicholas pulled out the key again. It felt heavier now, laden with the weight of its potential. He turned it over in his hand, the tarnished brass catching the light. "Do you think this could be for the safe house?" Emma asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Maybe," Nicholas said. "We'll find out tomorrow." Emma nodded, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "Thank you, Mr. Harper, for not giving up." Nicholas looked at her, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. "We're in this together," he said. "We'll see it through." That night, as he lay in bed, Nicholas thought about Sarah, her words in the notebook, her promise to Allison, and her unshakable belief in doing the right thing. He wondered if she had known how much it would cost her, and yet he couldn't help but feel that, in some way, she was still guiding them, still fighting to protect the people she cared about. Tomorrow, they would follow the lead to Marjorie, and with every step, Nicholas felt closer to understanding not just the truth about Allison, but also the truth about himself. The next morning, Nicholas and Emma set out early, the key securely tucked into Nicholas's coat pocket. The name Marjorie had lingered in his mind all night, teasing him with the possibility of answers. The drive was long and quiet, the snowy landscape stretching endlessly before them. Emma, as usual, clutched Mr. Thumper in her lap, her expression a mixture of hope and nerves. The address they had been given led them to a modest house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The house was surrounded by tall pine trees, and its red shutters stood out against the white of the snow. Nicholas pulled the car into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting still for a moment as he studied the house. "Are you ready?" he asked Emma, glancing at her. She nodded, her grip tightening on her rabbit. "I'm ready." They walked up to the door together, Nicholas knocking firmly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal an older woman with a kind face framed by gray hair. She wore a thick sweater and jeans, her hands dusted with flour as if she'd been baking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes moving from Nicholas to Emma and back again. Nicholas cleared his throat. "Are you Marjorie? We were told you might know something about a safe house Sarah Harper worked with." The woman's expression softened at the mention of Sarah's name. "Yes, I'm Marjorie, and I remember Sarah very well. Please, come in." She stepped aside, and they entered the warm, inviting house. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Marjorie led them to the living room and gestured for them to sit on the comfortable-looking couch. She settled into a chair across from them, her gaze thoughtful. "I haven't heard Sarah's name in a long time," she said. "She was a remarkable woman, always so determined to help others." "She was," Nicholas agreed, his voice quiet. "We're trying to find someone she helped. Allison and her daughter, Emma." He nodded toward Emma, who looked at Marjorie with wide eyes. "This is her daughter." Marjorie's face softened further as she looked at Emma. "So, you're Allison's little girl. My goodness, you've grown. You knew my mom?" Emma asked, her voice filled with wonder. Marjorie nodded. "I did. She stayed here for a while, years ago. She was scared, but she loved you more than anything. She talked about you all the time. Do you know where she went?" Nicholas asked, his voice tense with anticipation. Marjorie's expression turned somber. "I wish I did. She left one day, saying it was too dangerous to stay in one place for too long. She didn't tell me where she was going, only that she had to keep moving." Emma's shoulders slumped, the hope in her eyes dimming. "So, she's still out there somewhere," she murmured. Marjorie reached over and took Emma's hand gently. "If she's anything like the woman I knew, she's doing everything she can to stay safe and protect you." Nicholas pulled the key from his pocket and held it up. "We found this among Allison's things. Do you know what it might open?" Marjorie's eyes widened slightly as she studied the key. That looks like the key to the safe we kept here for families in crisis. Sarah and I used it to store important documents, letters, and anything they didn't want falling into the wrong hands. Is the safe still here? Nicholas asked, his pulse quickening. Marjorie nodded. It's in the basement. No one's used it since Sarah passed. Come, I'll show you. They followed her down a narrow staircase into a cool, dimly lit basement. Marjorie crossed the room to a cabinet against the far wall, bending down to pull it aside and reveal a small metal safe embedded in the wall behind it. She stepped back, gesturing for Nicholas to try the key. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and with a soft click, the safe opened. Inside was a collection of documents, folders, and a small wooden box. Nicholas carefully removed the items and set them on a nearby table. Emma leaned in close as they began to go through the contents. Most of the papers were related to families Sarah and Marjorie had helped, names, dates, and locations. But as Nicholas flipped through the folders, he found one labeled Allison. He opened it, revealing a small stack of papers and photographs. One was a copy of a restraining order filed against the man in the photo they had found earlier. Another was a letter from Allison to Sarah, thanking her for helping her escape. But it was the last item in the folder that caught Nicholas's attention. A map with a series of locations marked in red ink. What is this? Emma asked, pointing to the map. I think it's a route, Nicholas said, studying it. Maybe the places your mom went after she left here. Marjorie nodded. It's possible. Sarah and I used to help families plan safe routes out of town. This might be where Allison went next. Emma's eyes lit up with renewed determination. Then we have to follow it. We have to see if she's there. Nicholas hesitated. The map was old, and the locations marked could be empty or abandoned by now. But he couldn't ignore the hope in Emma's voice, or the responsibility he felt to help her see this through. We'll go, he said finally. We'll follow the map. Emma threw her arms around him, her gratitude overwhelming. Thank you, Mr. Harper. I know we'll find her. Marjorie smiled warmly, her eyes shining. Sarah would be proud of you both. She always believed in miracles. Nicholas swallowed hard, the weight of Sarah's memory pressing heavily on his heart. As they left Marjorie's house with the map in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the answers they had been searching for. The car felt heavier as Nicholas and Emma drove toward the first marked location on the map. The road stretched long and empty ahead of them, flanked by trees weighed down with snow. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the map that rested on her lap. The earlier excitement in her voice had faded into something quieter, a hope tempered by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Nicholas glanced at her. You okay? Emma nodded, though her expression was serious. Do you think she'll be there? At one of these places? He hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. The map was old, and there was no guarantee that Allison was still following the same path. But he couldn't bring himself to extinguish the flicker of hope in Emma's eyes. I think it's a good place to start, he said finally. And if she's not there, we'll keep looking. Emma seemed to take comfort in his words, nodding resolutely. She'll be somewhere. We just have to find her. The first location was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The house was set back from the road, its paint peeling and its shutters hanging crookedly. Nicholas pulled the car to a stop and turned to Emma. Stay close to me, he said. We don't know who's here. Emma nodded, clutching Mr. Thumper tightly as they approached the house. Nicholas knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the winter afternoon. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with weary eyes and a face lined with age. She studied them cautiously. Can I help you? She asked. We're looking for someone, Nicholas said, holding up the map. Her name is Allison. She stayed here once, years ago. Do you remember her? The woman's expression softened slightly, though her guard didn't drop completely. I remember Allison, she said. She came through here with her daughter. Stayed for a little while, but she didn't stay long. Do you know where she went? Emma asked, her voice filled with urgency. The woman hesitated, glancing down at Emma. She mentioned heading west, toward a friend's place in the next county over. But that was a long time ago. I'm sorry, honey. I don't know more than that. Emma's shoulders sagged, but she nodded politely. Thank you. The woman's gaze lingered on Emma for a moment, a hint of sympathy in her eyes. Your mama loved you. She talked about you all the time. Emma managed a small smile, but the disappointment was clear on her face as they turned back toward the car. Nicholas felt a pang of helplessness. He had promised to help her, but each dead end made him wonder if they were chasing ghosts. As they drove to the next location, Emma sat silently, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered fields outside the window. Nicholas wanted to say something to reassure her, but he wasn't sure what. Instead, he focused on the road, his thoughts swirling with doubts. The second location was a motel on the edge of a highway. It was small and run down, its neon sign flickering in the fading light. Nicholas parked the car and they walked into the office, where a middle-aged man sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. Can I help you? The man asked, barely looking up. We're looking for someone who might have stayed here, Nicholas said. Her name is Allison. She had a young daughter with her. The man frowned, clearly trying to recall. Allison, yeah, I think I remember her. Quiet lady, kept to herself. That must have been 8, maybe 9 years ago. She only stayed a couple nights. Do you know where she went? Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. Sorry, kid. She didn't say much. Just paid her bill and left. Emma looked down, her grip on Mr. Thumper tightening. Nicholas placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. Thanks anyway, Nicholas said, his voice tight. He and Emma walked back to the car, the weight of another dead end settling heavily between them. As they continued down the road, the sky darkened, the first stars beginning to twinkle against the deepening blue. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice small but determined. She's still out there. I know she is. Nicholas glanced at her, his heart aching at the mixture of hope and sadness in her tone. We'll find her, he said. It's just going to take time. The third location was a shelter in a larger town, a bustling building filled with the sounds of chatter and the clinking of dishes. The woman at the front desk greeted them warmly when they explained their search. Allison, she said thoughtfully. I remember her. She stayed here for a few weeks with her little girl. That was a long time ago. Do you know where she went after that? Nicholas asked. The woman nodded slowly. She talked about heading to a safe house in the city. Said it was the only place she could think of where she might finally settle down. I can give you the address, but that was years ago. I can't promise she's still there. Emma's eyes lit up with renewed determination. It's worth a try. Nicholas thanked the woman and took the address, folding the paper carefully before slipping it into his pocket. As they left the shelter, Emma turned to him, her face bright with hope. This is it, she said. I can feel it. Nicholas wished he could share her certainty, but he nodded anyway. Let's find out. The drive to the city was long and quiet, the weight of the search pressing heavily on both of them. As they approached the address, Nicholas felt his heart quicken. The building was an old apartment complex, its bricks weathered but sturdy. Nicholas parked the car and turned to Emma. Ready? He asked. She nodded, her small hand reaching for his. Together, they walked to the door, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering between them as Nicholas raised his hand to knock. Nicholas knocked firmly on the apartment door, the sound echoing down the dimly lit hallway. Beside him, Emma held her breath, her small fingers gripping Mr. Thumper tightly. For a moment, there was only silence, and Nicholas felt a familiar knot of doubt tighten in his chest. What if this was just another dead end? What if the trail they were following had long gone cold? Then came the faint sound of footsteps. Emma's eyes widened, her grip tightening. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a woman with tired eyes and streaks of gray in her once dark hair. She looked older than the photographs they had found, her face etched with lines of worry and wear. But even with the years that had passed, Nicholas knew immediately who she was. Allison, he said, his voice low and careful, as if afraid to scare her away. The woman froze, her gaze shifting from Nicholas to Emma. Her eyes softened, and a hand flew to her mouth as her body seemed to sag against the doorframe. Emma, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the girl clutching the stuffed rabbit. "Is it really you?" Emma nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "It's me, Mom." Before another word could be spoken, Allison dropped to her knees and pulled Emma into her arms, holding her as though she might disappear. Emma clung to her, her own tears falling freely as she buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Nicholas stepped back slightly, giving them space while a lump rose in his throat. The moment was raw and fragile, years of separation and longing converging in the dim hallway. "I thought I'd lost you," Allison murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I'd never see you again." Emma pulled back, just enough to look up at her mother's face. "I never stopped looking for you," she said. "I knew you were still out there." Allison's hands cupped Emma's face as she studied her, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You've grown so much," she said, her voice a mixture of wonder and heartbreak. "I've missed so much." Nicholas cleared his throat gently, and Allison's gaze shifted to him for the first time. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, followed by confusion. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Nicholas Harper," he said. I'm the one who's been helping Emma. My wife Sarah knew you." At the mention of Sarah's name, Allison's expression changed. Her eyes filled with pain, and she slowly stood, keeping one arm around Emma. "Sarah," she said softly. "She saved my life. I owe her everything." Nicholas felt a pang of sorrow at the way Allison spoke of Sarah, her gratitude mixed with grief. "She never told me about you," he said. "I didn't know until Emma found me." Allison nodded, as if the explanation made sense. "She was protecting me. She knew what kind of danger I was in. The less people who knew, the safer I was." Emma looked up at her mother, her brow furrowed. "Danger? Was it him? The man you were running from?" Allison's face darkened, and she pulled Emma closer. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was him. He wasn't just dangerous. He was cruel, controlling. I knew I had to get away, for your sake and for your brother's." Emma froze, her eyes widening. "My brother," she whispered. "You mean he's alive?" Allison nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. "Yes, he's alive. He's been staying with me here, trying to rebuild his life after everything he's been through." The door to the apartment opened wider, and Nicholas saw a young man standing in the background. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a hardened expression that softened slightly when his eyes met Emma's. There was an undeniable resemblance between them. The same dark curls, the same determined set of their chins. "Is this?" Emma began, her voice barely audible. Allison nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, this is your brother." The young man stepped forward cautiously, his gaze never leaving Emma. "You're my sister," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I've thought about you every day." Emma let out a small sob and launched herself into his arms. He caught her easily, holding her tightly as though he'd never let her go. Nicholas felt his chest tighten at the sight. For the first time in years, Emma looked completely at peace, wrapped in the arms of her family. Allison wiped her eyes and turned to Nicholas. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said. "You brought her back to me. You brought us all back together." Nicholas shook his head. "It wasn't just me. Emma's the one who never gave up. She's the reason we're all here." Allison smiled, her gaze shifting to her daughter. "She always was strong," she said. "Stronger than I ever gave her credit for." They moved inside the apartment, where the warmth of the space wrapped around them. It was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and a sense of quiet resilience. Over steaming mugs of tea, Allison began to share her story. She spoke of the years she had spent running, always looking over her shoulder, always trying to stay one step ahead of the man who had haunted her. She told them about the shelters, the safe houses, and the people like Sarah who had helped her along the way. And she spoke of the guilt she carried, knowing how much Emma and her brother had endured because of her decisions. "I wanted to come back for you," she said, her voice breaking, "but I was so afraid. I thought I was keeping you safe by staying away." Emma reached for her hand, her small fingers wrapping around her mother's. "I understand now," she said softly. "I'm just glad we're together again." Nicholas watched the reunion with a mixture of relief and sadness. He thought of Sarah, of the sacrifices she had made to help Allison, and of the ways she had quietly carried the weight of others' pain. He wondered what she would say if she were here now, seeing the family she had worked so hard to protect finally reunited. As the evening wore on, Nicholas felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He had started this journey thinking he was helping Emma, but it had become something more. In piecing together the fragments of Allison's life, he had also begun to heal the fractures in his own. When it was time to leave, Allison hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us back what we thought we'd lost forever." Nicholas nodded, his own voice too choked to respond. As he and Emma stepped out into the crisp night air, he felt lighter than he had in years. The stars above seemed brighter, the world softer. Emma slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking up at him. "I am," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." They walked back to the car together, the snow crunching under their feet, and as they drove away, Nicholas felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace and the quiet certainty that they had all found their way home. The days following the reunion at Allison's apartment were a blur of warmth and newfound connections. Nicholas and Emma stayed in the city for a while, giving Allison and her son, whose name was David, the space and time to reconnect as a family. For Nicholas, the quiet moments were filled with reflection, memories of Sarah lingering in his thoughts like a soft, persistent melody. On Christmas Eve, Allison invited them back to her apartment for dinner. The small living room had been transformed with simple decorations. Paper snowflakes hung in the windows, and a scrappy but proud little tree stood in the corner, its branches adorned with a mismatched assortment of ornaments. It wasn't grand, but it radiated love and care, the kind of warmth that had been missing from Nicholas's life for far too long. Emma was practically glowing as she helped Allison set the table, her laughter echoing through the apartment. David sat beside Nicholas, carving the turkey with a steady hand. The young man's reserved demeanor had softened over the past few days, and though he still carried the weight of his experiences as a veteran, Nicholas could see the beginnings of healing in his eyes. "Thank you," David said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "for bringing Emma here. For all of this." Nicholas shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. She's the one who kept the hope alive. I just followed her lead." David nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "Still, you didn't have to, and it means a lot. More than I can say." Before Nicholas could respond, Allison called them to the table. They gathered around, the meal laid out before them, a modest but heartfelt feast. Emma insisted on saying grace, her hands folded tightly as she closed her eyes. "Thank you for bringing us all together," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for giving us a second chance. And thank you for the people who helped us get here." Nicholas felt his throat tighten as Emma finished her prayer, her words settling over the room like a blessing. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily as laughter punctuated their stories. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt a sense of belonging, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. After dinner, as they sat around the tiny Christmas tree, Emma handed out small, wrapped gifts she had insisted on buying with what little money she had saved. Nicholas unwrapped his to find a simple, handmade ornament, a wooden heart painted with the words "Family is the greatest gift." His vision blurred as he ran his thumb over the lettering, his chest tight with emotion. "I made it for you," Emma said, her voice shy but proud. "I wanted you to have something special." Nicholas cleared his throat, blinking back tears. "It's perfect. Thank you." Allison handed him a cup of coffee, her own expression filled with gratitude. "She's right, you know. Family really is the greatest gift. And you've given that back to us." As the night wore on, the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the city in a quiet, peaceful stillness. Emma fell asleep on the couch, her head resting on her brother's shoulder as David dozed beside her. Allison and Nicholas sat by the fire, the room bathed in a warm, golden glow. "She talked about you a lot," Allison said suddenly, her voice soft. Nicholas turned to her, confused. "Who?" "Sarah," she said, smiling faintly. "When I stayed at the safe house, she told me about you, about how much you meant to her. She said you were the strongest person she'd ever known, even if you didn't believe it." Nicholas felt a pang in his chest, his thoughts flashing back to the photo of Sarah and Allison laughing together. "She never told me about you," he said. "I wish she had. Maybe I could have done more." Allison shook her head. "You've done more than enough. Sarah didn't tell you because she wanted to protect you. She knew how much you'd already been through, and she didn't want to add to it. She carried a lot on her shoulders, but it was because she loved you, and she trusted you would find your way." Nicholas stared into the fire, the flames dancing and flickering as her words settled over him. He had spent so many years questioning, doubting, carrying the weight of what he had lost. But now, in this moment, he felt a quiet sense of clarity. Sarah had trusted him, and in his own way, he had honored that trust by helping Emma, by bringing this family back together. "You saved her," Allison said gently, breaking the silence. "Sarah may not be here, but everything you've done has kept her spirit alive, and I think she'd be proud of you." Nicholas didn't respond right away, his emotions too tangled to put into words. But as he looked around the room, at Emma's peaceful face, at the soft glow of the fire, at the sense of love and connection that filled the space, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. When it was time to leave, Allison hugged him tightly at the door. "You're always welcome here," she said. "You're part of this family now." Nicholas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." As he and Emma drove back to the small motel where they were staying, the streets were quiet, the snow falling softly around them. Emma stirred in the passenger seat, her sleepy voice breaking the silence. "Do you think Sarah knows?" she asked. "That we found each other?" Nicholas glanced at her, his chest tightening at the innocence of her question. "I think she does," he said. "And I think she's happy." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes drifting closed again. Nicholas drove on, his thoughts filled with memories of Sarah. For the first time, the memories didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a gift. Back at the motel, Emma climbed into bed, clutching Mr. Thumper as she drifted off to sleep. Nicholas sat by the window, watching the snow fall and the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. The wooden ornament Emma had given him rested on the nightstand, its simple message echoing in his mind. Family is the greatest gift. He thought of Sarah, of everything she had sacrificed to help Allison and Emma. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the unexpected turns that had led to this moment. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. As the clock struck midnight and Christmas Day began, Nicholas whispered a silent prayer of thanks for Emma, for Allison, for the love and light he had found in the midst of his darkest days, and for Sarah, whose faith in him had guided him home. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. And inside, for the first time in a decade, Nicholas Harper felt truly at peace.